The house was small, tucked away in the middle of a typical neighborhood in a typical city. The facade had a touch of neglect. The windows always seemed fogged, as if a mist had taken over the interior. It was the kind of house people would barely notice when passing by. The kind of place that seemed calm at first glance, but hid a dense story, a reality that would never reach the ears of the neighbors. Diane had moved into that neighborhood 3 years ago, after a long period of moving from city to city, following a routine that up until then seemed uneventful. She was 42, with a tired gaze, but a mysterious energy that disguised the complexity of her days. To the neighbors, she was just another solitary mother, trying to get by with her young son, Daniel. But it wasn't quite like that. What few knew was that little Daniel didn't live like any other child. At 9 years old, Daniel had been diagnosed with autism, a condition he didn't fully understand. But his mother, Diane, made sure to keep it hidden. Why? The reason wasn't in the words, but in the actions. Diane, as much as she tried, couldn't handle the reactions of the people around her. The fear of judgment, of harsh glances and heavy words, consumed her so much that she thought it safer to keep Daniel inside, away from everything and everyone. She had decided that the basement would be the place he would stay, and it was there, in that small underground space, that Daniel spent most of his time. He had his own makeshift room, with toys, books, and an old television Diane had bought from a second-hand store. It wasn't a perfect place, but it was the only one she could offer, and in her mind, it was enough. She believed that by doing this, she was protecting her son from the world outside. But what she didn't know, or perhaps preferred to ignore, was that she was creating a prison for Daniel and for herself. In the neighborhood, Diane tried to maintain a calm appearance. She would visit the bakery on the corner, smile kindly at the neighbors, but always avoided deeper conversations. Questions about Daniel's father, for example, were always deflected with quick, empty answers. She never told much about her life before moving there, and the truth about what went on inside her house was never mentioned. It was a simple routine. Diane would leave the house in the morning, go to work in an accounting office, and return in the late afternoon. During the time she was away, Daniel would stay in the basement, alone. She had installed a security camera to ensure he was safe. The plan was simple. He wouldn't leave, she wouldn't leave, and that way, everything would be fine. But over time, things started to get difficult. Daniel became more restless. The loneliness was consuming him. The basement, which once seemed like a safe and controlled space, now felt like a cramped, suffocating place where the boy spent hours without any interaction with the outside world. Diane noticed he was becoming more agitated, more nervous, but didn't know what to do. She wanted somehow to protect him from a world that, to her, wasn't prepared to accept him. That's when she started thinking of solutions. Maybe he could have some therapy. Maybe he could go to a specialized school. But deep down, she knew these options were expensive, out of reach, and, to be honest, she was afraid to expose herself even more. The idea of showing the world that her son was different felt like a sentence of condemnation. No, it was safer to keep him hidden. Diane knew that this couldn't last forever. She knew the secret couldn't be kept forever. But at that moment, she believed it was still possible. Life was under control. The day-to-day was peaceful. And that's all that mattered, right? Little by little, Diane's life began to spiral into a growing silence and anguish. But the real change would come from where she least expected it. One ordinary afternoon, on a Friday, when the sun was setting low on the horizon, something happened, and that something would change everything. The next morning, Diane woke up earlier than usual, a feeling in her gut telling her that something was about to happen. The sound of the alarm was muffled by the incessant thoughts that had kept her awake for the past few nights. She was used to living in silence, but today felt different. The air was heavy, as though something was about to break the delicate balance she had carefully constructed over the years. She went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, as she always did, and glanced at the clock. Daniel was still asleep in the basement, as he usually was before she left for work. The house was strangely quiet, as if even the walls were waiting for the inevitable. Diane sat at the table, staring at her coffee cup, trying to shake off the discomfort that consumed her. But she couldn't. For weeks she had felt a growing pressure in her chest. The looks from the neighbors, the whispered comments she tried to ignore, the veiled remarks about the strange behavior of the boy. She never heard them directly, but she knew they were there, behind closed curtains, in quick conversations in the hallway or at the bakery. Diane was aware that something was about to shatter her little world, but she didn't know what. When she finished her coffee, she got up and went down to the basement. The basement door was locked, as always. Diane hesitated for a moment, but then opened it, letting the smell of mold and dampness invade the fresh morning air. She descended the stairs toward Daniel's room, where he was sitting on the floor, eyes glued to the TV screen, immersed in his world. He didn't notice her presence. "Daniel," she said softly, trying to break the silence, "are you ready for the day?" He didn't answer, as usual. She knew he didn't communicate easily, but she felt a deep bond with her son. He was down there, in his little space, and she was protecting him, or so she believed. But today something was different. Daniel was off. His eyes were more glazed than usual, his posture tense. He didn't look at her, but Diane felt an immediate discomfort. Something in his behavior was out of place. She approached him, gently touching his shoulder. "Daniel, what's going on?" she asked, concern taking over her voice. He suddenly turned to her, as if being awoken from a trance, and their eyes met. Diane felt a chill run down her spine, an unsettling feeling she couldn't explain. He stared at her for a moment too long, as if deciding whether to speak or retreat back into silence. "He knows, Mom," Daniel finally said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "They're going to know." Diane's blood ran cold. What did he mean by that? How did he know? Why was he saying those words that made no sense to her? She tried to hide her shock, but her hands began to sweat, and her heart was racing in her chest. "Who will know, Daniel?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he quickly got up and ran to the corner of the basement, where he always kept his toys and books, as if he were escaping the conversation. Diane felt a tightness in her throat. She knew she shouldn't push him, but her mind was full of questions, all unanswered. What was happening to her son? Did he know something she didn't? And more importantly, what did he mean by those words? She closed the basement door carefully and climbed the stairs, trying to keep her composure, but something inside her told her that everything was about to change. Something was about to happen, something she couldn't control. Hours later, as Diane sat in her office, preparing some documents, the sound of the doorbell snapped her out of her thoughts. She got up, walked to the door, and when she opened it, she saw the figure of a woman standing on her doorstep. It was the local police officer, Lisa Harper, well known in the community for being kind but extremely professional. "Good morning, Mrs. Diane, right?" Lisa asked, with a smile that didn't hide the tension in her eyes. "Can I have a word with you for a moment?" Diane swallowed hard, anxiety creeping over her. "Of course, what's happened?" "We've received a report," Lisa said, her tone serious. "About your son. Can we come in?" Those words made Diane's heart stop for a moment. A report? She didn't understand. Everything had been kept secret. Everything was under control. And yet here she was, being confronted by a police officer who didn't bring good news. Diane stepped away from the door, allowing Lisa to enter. What was happening now? She knew that nothing would be the same. Diane sat across from Officer Lisa Harper in the small living room, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, trying to steady the trembling that was threatening to overtake her. Lisa had taken a seat across from her, but there was no sense of comfort in the room now. It felt colder, more suffocating. "Mrs. Caldwell," Lisa began, her voice steady but cautious, "we've been getting some concerns from the neighbors about your son. They've reported some unusual behavior. They mentioned him being kept isolated in your home, and there were even whispers about him being confined to the basement." Diane's stomach twisted. How had they found out? She had taken every precaution to keep Daniel's world hidden from the outside. No one knew. Or at least she thought no one knew. "Is that true?" Lisa pressed, her eyes scanning Diane's face, searching for some reaction. Diane knew she couldn't lie, not with the officer sitting in front of her. But she had to protect Daniel. She had to protect him at all costs. "Daniel, he's different," Diane said, her voice barely above a whisper. He struggles with the world outside. It's not safe for him, not in a normal school, not with people who don't understand him." Lisa nodded slowly, understanding the implication, but maintaining her professional composure. "Mrs. Caldwell, we're not here to judge. We just want to make sure your son is safe. We've also received reports about his lack of proper medical care and a lack of social interaction. Isolation like that isn't healthy for a child." The weight of those words hit Diane like a hammer. She had kept Daniel away from the world to protect him. But now it was clear that her choices had consequences. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away before Lisa could notice. I didn't know what else to do," Diane admitted, her voice cracking. "He's been through so much already." He was. He was hurt by people who didn't understand him. "I thought I could give him the space he needed, the safety he deserved. The world out there, it's cruel." Lisa's expression softened, but she didn't back down. "We understand, Mrs. Caldwell, but isolating him like this, keeping him locked away, could lead to serious consequences for both you and Daniel." Diane felt as if the ground beneath her was slipping away. The walls she had so carefully built around her son were crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She had hoped, prayed even, that she could protect him from the harshness of the world. But now the truth was clear. She had failed him. Lisa stood up, her voice firm yet gentle. I'm going to have to call in social services. Mrs. Caldwell, we need to make sure Daniel is in a safe and supportive environment. He needs medical attention, therapy, and he needs to be around other children. Diane's breath hitched in her chest, and she felt her world collapsing around her. She hadn't anticipated this. She had thought she could keep Daniel hidden, that she could control everything. But now her worst fears were coming true. She was losing him. Please no, Diane begged, her voice trembling. Please don't take him away. I can do better. I'll do anything. Just don't take him. Lisa paused, her hand resting on the doorframe. I'm not here to take him away. Mrs. Caldwell, I'm here to make sure he gets the help he needs. That's all. But if you don't cooperate, things could escalate. This is about Daniel's well-being. Diane stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her, but she fought to keep her composure. She had no choice now but to face the truth. She had to let go of the illusion she had created. For Daniel's sake. Okay, Diane whispered, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. I'll cooperate. Just don't let them take him from me. Lisa gave her a small, reassuring smile. I'll make sure the right steps are taken. You're not alone in this. As Lisa left the house, Diane stood in the doorway, her mind racing. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't protect Daniel forever. And for the first time in years, Diane wondered if she had made the right choices for him. Would he be better off in the world she had tried to shield him from? Or would he be broken by it? She walked slowly back to the basement, where Daniel was still sitting, eyes vacant, staring at the screen. He didn't look up when she entered the room, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. "Mom?" Daniel said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Is it time?" Diane nodded, swallowing her emotions. "Yes, Daniel, it's time." And with that, Diane knew the real battle was only just beginning. The world she had tried so hard to protect him from was now forcing its way into their lives, and she would have to face it whether she was ready or not. The next few days were a blur for Diane. After the officer's visit, everything seemed to move at a pace she couldn't control. The phone calls came one after another, social workers, doctors, therapists, each one a reminder that her carefully constructed life was falling apart. But in the midst of it all, one thing became clear. Daniel would never be the same. Neither would she. The first visit from the social worker came the following afternoon. A woman named Samantha Miller, calm and collected, entered Diane's home with a clipboard in hand. Her demeanor was professional, but there was something warm about the way she smiled, as though she understood the gravity of the situation. Diane, on the other hand, couldn't shake the tightness in her chest. Samantha sat down at the kitchen table, and Diane joined her. Her hands were still shaking. "I know this isn't easy, Mrs. Caldwell," Samantha began, her voice soft but firm. "But we're here to help. Our goal is to make sure Daniel gets the care he needs, and that he's in a safe environment." Diane nodded, but the words didn't register. She couldn't focus. Her mind kept flashing to the basement where Daniel was still locked away in his world, away from the prying eyes of the world she had tried so hard to protect him from. "I've been told that Daniel has some significant behavioral challenges," Samantha continued, flipping through her notes. "Can you tell me more about what he's been going through?" Diane hesitated, her throat tightening. She didn't want to explain it, didn't want to make it sound like a failure. But the words came out anyway, a confession she had been avoiding for years. "Daniel, he has autism," Diane whispered. "He's different. He can't handle normal life. He gets overwhelmed, and when he gets overwhelmed, he shuts down. Sometimes he lashes out, sometimes he just goes quiet. I didn't know how to help him, so I kept him here in the basement, where he could be safe." Samantha's expression softened, but she didn't speak immediately. Diane could feel the weight of her judgment, but at least it wasn't harsh. She had prepared herself for scorn, for accusations, but Samantha's quiet listening made the confession even harder. "And Daniel, he's not attending school?" Samantha asked, her voice steady. "Has he had access to any therapy or medical care?" Diane shook her head. "No, he was never able to adjust to school. They told me he was a problem, that he was disruptive. He couldn't focus, couldn't keep up, and the doctors, they didn't understand him either. I thought if I kept him home, kept him safe from all of that, he'd be okay." Samantha nodded slowly. "I can see how much you care for him, Mrs. Caldwell, but isolating him from the world isn't the solution. Daniel needs help. He needs support from professionals who specialize in autism, and he needs to be around other children who can teach him how to function in the world." The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around Diane. The truth was inescapable. She had failed Daniel. She had thought she was protecting him, but in reality she had just been keeping him trapped. Samantha glanced at the clock on the wall and stood up. "I'm going to need to talk to Daniel, Mrs. Caldwell. I know this might be difficult, but it's important that we begin to understand what he needs. It's the first step in getting him the help he deserves." Diane's heart raced. She hadn't prepared herself for this. She hadn't prepared Daniel. "I'll go get him," Diane said quietly, her voice betraying her nerves. She made her way down to the basement, her feet heavy on the stairs. The air down here was always thick with the musty smell of old furniture and forgotten spaces. The dim light flickered overhead as she approached the door to Daniel's room. He was sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth, his eyes distant as he stared at the wall. She had always called it his safe space, a place where he didn't have to face the world, where he could shut it all out. "Daniel," Diane said softly, kneeling beside him. "Sweetheart, we need to go upstairs. There's someone here to talk to you." Daniel didn't look at her. He kept rocking, his hands pressing against his ears, as though the world was too loud for him to bear. Diane swallowed hard, her heart breaking at the sight of him. "I know you don't want to," she whispered, "but this is important. This could help you, Daniel. It could help us." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel looked up at her. His eyes were filled with confusion, but there was something else in them, too, fear. He didn't want to go up there. He didn't want to face the world. But he nodded just slightly, and Diane took his hand, leading him up the stairs. When they entered the kitchen, Samantha was already sitting at the table, waiting. Her expression was kind, but it still held an authority that was difficult to ignore. Daniel froze in the doorway, his eyes darting around the room, taking in the unfamiliar faces, the unfamiliar space. His grip tightened on Diane's hand. "This is Samantha, Daniel," Diane said, trying to keep her voice calm. "She's here to help us." Samantha stood up, her tone soft and gentle. "Hi." "Daniel." I know you might be feeling a little nervous right now, but I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to understand what's going on in your world so that I can help make it better." Daniel didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at her, his body tense. Diane could see the panic building in him. He was overwhelmed. Too many people, too many expectations. Samantha took a step back, giving Daniel space. "We're going to take it slow, okay? I just want to know what you need." For a moment, no one spoke. The room was filled with an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of Daniel's breathing, quick and shallow. Then, without warning, Daniel let go of Diane's hand. He slowly walked to the corner of the room and sat down, curling his knees to his chest. His eyes were still fixed on the floor, but Diane could see his lips moving slightly, as if he was saying something to himself. Diane's heart broke all over again. She had no idea how to fix this, no idea how to help him feel safe in a world that was constantly changing around him. And yet in that moment, Diane knew one thing for certain. She was ready to fight for him, whatever it took, because Daniel was worth it. He had always been worth it. The following weeks were a whirlwind of appointments, evaluations, and difficult conversations. Diane had never felt more lost and out of control. Each day she had to face the reality of the situation, and each day it became harder to breathe. But there was one thing that was clear in the midst of all the chaos. She could not and would not let go of her son. No matter what anyone else said, no matter how overwhelming the process seemed, she would find a way to help him. Samantha continued to visit regularly, always checking in on Daniel, monitoring his progress, and providing her with advice on how to handle his behavior. The first breakthrough came when Daniel finally agreed to leave the house for short walks around the neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was a step forward, and Diane held on to that victory as if it were everything. On one of these walks, Diane watched from a distance as Daniel stood on the sidewalk, staring at the sky. She could see the way he was processing the world around him, the cars passing by, the sounds of birds, the wind brushing against his face. He didn't say much, but for the first time in a long while, Diane felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't the life she had imagined for her son, but maybe it could be a life worth living. Things were starting to change, slowly but surely. Daniel began to engage with more people. Even if it was just a word or two here and there, his time spent in the basement became less frequent as he began to show more interest in the world outside. Diane kept up her routine of therapy sessions, keeping everything structured and predictable, knowing that consistency was key. But as the days passed, Diane couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. She felt it every time she looked at her son, this sense of guilt, this overwhelming sense of loss. For all the progress Daniel had made, there was still so much to be done. He wasn't completely okay yet. He still struggled with so many things, and no matter how much she tried, she couldn't fix everything for him. She could only hope that with time things would improve. One day, while Diane was at the grocery store, she received an unexpected call from Samantha. She had been told it was about an update on Daniel's progress, and Diane rushed to answer, eager for more news. "Mrs. Caldwell," Samantha's voice was tight, and there was a slight tremor in it that immediately set off alarm bells in Diane's mind. "I need you to come to the center right away. There's something important we need to discuss." Her heart dropped. Something about the tone in Samantha's voice made Diane's blood run cold. She grabbed her purse and rushed out the door, barely taking the time to lock it behind her. The ride to the center was a blur, every moment stretching longer than the last. Diane's mind raced with a million thoughts. What could have happened? Why was she being called in so urgently? When she arrived, Samantha was waiting outside, her face pale. Without a word, she led Diane into a small conference room. There was no one else there, just the two of them. Diane sat down, anxiety clawing at her chest. I don't know how to say this, but... Samantha hesitated, biting her lip. Daniel's progress has been alarming. He's been having trouble processing emotions, and it's been affecting his behavior in ways that I'm concerned about. Diane felt a knot tighten in her stomach. What does that mean? Is he in danger? Samantha shook her head quickly. No, he's not in danger, but there's something happening that we didn't foresee. We've seen an increase in his outbursts at the center. He's been having episodes that are more intense than what we've previously observed. Diane's eyes widened, the fear beginning to set in. She hadn't seen any signs of regression at home. Daniel had been doing so well lately. Could she have missed something? I don't understand, Diane whispered, feeling the weight of every word. Why would he be worse? He seemed fine. Samantha's gaze softened. I think it's the transition. The world outside, it's overwhelming for him, and it's been difficult for him to cope with all the changes. The routine you've set at home, as much as it's been helpful, might not be enough to prepare him for the outside world. He's struggling more than we anticipated. Diane's heart sank. She hadn't prepared for this. She hadn't thought about how hard it would be for Daniel to go from the safety of their home to this new, unfamiliar world. But the truth hit her like a ton of bricks. She couldn't protect him forever. The world outside was unpredictable, and Daniel's ability to cope with that unpredictability was limited. No matter how much love she poured into him, there were things that could not be fixed so easily. What can I do? Diane asked, the desperation in her voice unmistakable. How do I help him? Samantha paused for a moment as if considering the question carefully. I think we need to reconsider his treatment plan. Maybe more intensive therapy, something tailored to his needs. We need to work on his coping mechanism, something more specific than what he's been receiving. Diane nodded, though she wasn't sure how much help that would be. But at least Samantha had a plan. At least they were doing something. You're doing everything you can, Mrs. Caldwell, Samantha said gently, but it's going to take time. There are no easy answers. But don't give up. Daniel needs you now more than ever. Diane left the center feeling drained. She felt like she was stuck on a treadmill, constantly moving, constantly trying but never getting any closer to a finish line. Her heart ached for Daniel. But in her heart, she knew one thing with certainty. She wasn't going to stop fighting for him. When she arrived home, she found Daniel sitting on the porch, his face hidden in his hands. He wasn't crying, but the way his shoulders shook told her everything. Diane knelt beside him, gently placing a hand on his back. I'm here, sweetheart, she whispered. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel looked up at her. His eyes tired but filled with trust. He wasn't okay. But maybe, just maybe, they could be okay together. The weeks that followed were filled with more sessions, more therapy, and more questions. Diane could feel the weight of her choices at every step. Each new recommendation from the specialists seemed to push her further into uncharted territory. Yet every step felt like a small victory. Daniel was responding, but there were moments when the progress felt too slow, when the setbacks seemed too great. At home, the small victories were becoming more evident, though still fragile. Daniel began to venture outside with more regularity, though his steps were always hesitant, his eyes constantly darting around as if the world around him could turn on him at any moment. His words had become more frequent, albeit simple, and he was beginning to engage more with Diane, even if it was just about the smallest of things, a comment about the weather, a question about the birds he saw flying by. But the fear was always there, in his eyes, in his fidgeting fingers, in his silent outbursts when the world overwhelmed him. Diane spent hours each night researching, reading, trying to understand autism better. She sought out every piece of information, even contacting other parents of children with similar struggles. She was determined to understand Daniel's world, to bridge the gap between the safety of their home and the harshness of the outside world that Daniel had yet to fully navigate. But nothing prepared her for the day she walked into the house to find it in chaos. It had been a long morning of therapy appointments, and Diane was hoping to finally have some peace. But when she stepped through the front door, she was hit with the sound of furniture being overturned and the unmistakable screech of Daniel's voice echoing through the house. Panic surged through her chest. "Daniel," she called, her voice trembling, as she rushed down the hallway toward the living room. She found him there, standing amidst the destruction, a lamp shattered on the floor, a chair tipped over, cushions scattered everywhere. His eyes were wide with fear, his breathing erratic, but there was something different this time. This wasn't just his usual distress. Something more dangerous, more uncontrollable was happening. "Daniel, it's okay," Diane called out, trying to keep her voice calm, though her heart was pounding. "It's okay, sweetie. Everything's okay." But Daniel didn't respond. He was rocking back and forth, his arms wrapped tightly around himself, mumbling something under his breath, his words incoherent. Diane's heart broke. She had seen Daniel struggle before, but this was something new. This wasn't the small bursts of frustration she'd been used to. It was something deeper, something more intense. She didn't know what had triggered this, but she knew one thing for sure. She had to get him back under control before things spiraled further. "Daniel, look at me," Diane said, crouching in front of him. "I'm here. You're safe." She reached out slowly, gently placing her hand on his arm. For a moment he stiffened, and Diane braced herself for the inevitable resistance. But then, unexpectedly, Daniel stopped moving. His body went still, and his gaze met hers. There was a long pause before he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to go outside anymore," he said, the words filled with a raw vulnerability. "I don't like it. It's too much. It's too loud. Everything is too much." Diane's heart broke for him. She understood what he meant. The world was too much. It was too overwhelming, too fast, too loud. But how could she protect him from everything he couldn't handle? How could she fix it? "I know, baby," she whispered, holding him close. "I know it's hard, but you're not alone. We'll work through this together. I'll never leave you." As they sat there on the floor, the sound of Daniel's soft sobs filled the room. Diane held him, rocking him gently as tears welled up in her own eyes. She had fought so hard to give him a better life, to help him adjust, but she couldn't fix everything. No matter how much she loved him, there were still things beyond her control. In the days that followed, Diane realized something that both terrified and comforted her. She couldn't protect Daniel from the world forever. There would be more outbursts, more moments where he couldn't cope. There would be times when it felt like she was failing him, but she had to remind herself that every small step forward, every moment of progress was worth it. She wasn't giving up. She couldn't. Daniel was her world, and no matter how difficult it became, no matter how painful, she would keep fighting for him. The following week, Diane made an appointment with Samantha to discuss Daniel's latest setbacks. The therapy had been difficult, and while there was still improvement, it wasn't as quick or as smooth as she had hoped. She needed advice. She needed guidance. When she sat down with Samantha, she recounted everything, the outbursts, the regression, the fears that Daniel was battling. Samantha listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. And then she spoke. "Mrs. Caldwell," Samantha began, her voice soft but firm, "I think it's time we address the root of the issue. You've been doing great, but we need to explore a more intensive therapy plan. Daniel's behavior is a result of so many factors: his autism, his fear of the world, his need for control. We need to dig deeper." Diane nodded, feeling a small flicker of hope. She had been working so hard, but maybe it was time to trust someone else's expertise. She needed to be open to change, to new methods, and to finding the right path for her son, no matter how difficult it might be. As the session ended and Diane made her way home, she knew that this would be a long journey, but the thought that she was finally on the right path, that she was getting the help she needed for Daniel, gave her the strength to keep going. They would get through this, together. Diane would never stop fighting for her son. Weeks had passed since Diane's meeting with Samantha, and the therapy sessions for Daniel had become more frequent. Every day felt like a step deeper into the unknown, and though there were moments of triumph, there were also long stretches of despair. But Diane wasn't backing down. She was fully committed to Daniel, no matter how long it took to get through the challenges ahead. Daniel had started showing small signs of progress. He wasn't having as many outbursts at home, though there were still times when the world felt too overwhelming for him. He had learned to use a few calming techniques that helped him regain control when his anxiety hit, but they were only effective for short periods. The world outside their home was still a battle he couldn't win alone. Diane tried to keep things as consistent as possible. She kept their routine tight, limiting anything that could trigger Daniel's fears. But even in the safety of their home, it wasn't easy. The walls she had built to protect him began to feel more like a prison than a sanctuary. There was only so much she could do to shield him from a world he couldn't understand. One afternoon, Diane arrived home after a long day at work to find the house eerily quiet. The silence felt wrong, like something had shifted in the air. Her heart skipped a beat as she called out for Daniel. "Daniel?" she called, stepping into the house and immediately noticing the absence of his usual presence. The house was empty, the front door slightly ajar. Panic surged through her chest. Daniel. She rushed down the hallway, her breath coming quicker with each step. As she neared the living room, she saw him. He was sitting in the corner of the room, hugging his knees to his chest, his face hidden in the crook of his arms. His body was trembling. Diane's stomach dropped as she approached him slowly, crouching down to his level. "Daniel, what happened?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with worry. "What's wrong, baby?" He didn't look up. His body shook harder now, and he was breathing in quick, shallow bursts. Diane felt her own breath hitch in her throat. She had never seen him like this before. "Talk to me, Daniel," she whispered, touching his shoulder. "It's okay. You're safe here." After a long pause, Daniel finally lifted his head, his eyes wide with terror. "I saw them," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "They were watching me." Diane's heart clenched. "Who, baby? Who was watching you?" He shook his head frantically, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for something or someone. "I don't know," he muttered. "They were everywhere. They were outside the windows. They were inside the walls." Diane took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She could feel the familiar weight of panic trying to claw its way into her chest. She had no idea what Daniel was seeing or hearing, but she had learned by now that his world was often filled with things that only he could understand. It wasn't uncommon for children with autism to struggle with sensory overload, and it was possible that Daniel's mind had been overwhelmed by something he couldn't control. "It's okay, Daniel," she said softly, brushing his hair back from his face. "No one's here. You're safe. There's no one watching you." But Daniel only shook his head harder. "I saw them. I saw them out there. They were in the street. They were hiding." Diane's heart raced. She knew that something deeper was happening. She had seen Daniel face his demons before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a typical meltdown. It felt like he was trapped in a world that wasn't even real, his mind playing tricks on him. "Daniel," Diane said, her voice firm but gentle. "Look at me. You're not alone. I'm here with you. We'll get through this." She slowly reached out and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into her embrace. His body was stiff at first, resisting the comfort she was offering, but eventually he let go of his tension, leaning into her. For a long time they just sat there, in the silence, holding on to each other. Diane's tears fell quietly, as she wondered how much longer she could protect him from his own mind. She wasn't sure how much time had passed before Daniel finally spoke again, his voice trembling. "I want to go outside. I want to see the world, but I'm scared. I'm scared they'll find me." Diane held him tighter, her heart breaking as she fought to hold back her own fear. She had been trying to protect him, to shield him from everything that hurt him. But was she doing the right thing? Was she helping him by keeping him locked away in their home, isolated from the world he so desperately wanted to understand? "I know, Daniel," she whispered softly. "I know it's scary, but you don't have to do it alone. We'll take it one step at a time, together." As she sat there, comforting her son, Diane made a promise to herself. She would find a way to help Daniel face the world, but she would never stop fighting to keep him safe. She had already come so far, and even if it meant taking risks and stepping into the unknown, she would continue to push for his future. She would not let fear control his life any longer. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the quiet neighborhood, filling the house with soft light. Diane sat across from Daniel at the kitchen table, watching him pick at his breakfast with a distant look in his eyes. She knew what he was thinking. He wanted to go outside. He wanted to see the world, but the fears still gripped him tightly. Every time he tried, the weight of the unknown sent him retreating back into the safety of their home. But today was different. Diane had made a decision, one she never thought she would have the courage to make. "Daniel," she said gently, setting down her coffee cup, "what if we try going for a short walk today? Just a few steps outside. No pressure." Daniel's hand froze over his plate, his body tensing. His eyes flickered toward the window, where the world stretched beyond the glass, waiting. "I don't know." "Mom," he whispered, "what if they're still out there?" Diane reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it reassuringly. Then we faced them together. Silence hung between them. Then slowly Daniel nodded. They got ready, taking their time. Diane let Daniel set the pace, allowing him to gather his courage. When they finally stepped toward the front door, Diane could feel his hand trembling in hers. She gave him a small, encouraging smile, just one step at a time. Daniel took a deep breath, his fingers gripping hers tightly. Then, with slow, cautious movements, he stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sounds of the world unfamiliar, yet strangely welcoming. They stood there for a moment, just breathing. Daniel turned to his mother, his expression unreadable. "It's not as scary as I thought." Diane laughed softly, wiping away a tear before he could see it. "No, baby, it's not." For the first time in years, she felt hope, real, tangible hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. But today, this small victory was proof that they could keep moving forward, together.